Hello. This lecture is concerned with feedback for student learning. There are lots of different approaches and there'll be a number of suggestions made during the lecture. Not all will be appropriate to your context, but some will, and it's your task to find out what would benefit your students and to think about what might enhance your practice. Let's have a look at this notion of feedback for student learning. This isn't necessarily feedback on particular bits of students' work. It's very important that we broaden out this concept. And feedback is part of the contract between the tutor and the student. There's an expectation that students have that they will receive feedback. And I think so often it's been reduced to thinking about feedback as a kind of commentary or an annotation on a student's work, as though the production of some kind of assignment or a written submission is necessary in order to elicit comment or feedback from a tutor. But more recently we've seen there's been an attempt to see feedback as something much more sustained, much more supportive of the student journey. But even then it can be reduced to the idea of a few MCQ questions at the end of a session. And one of the tensions in higher education today is between students' evident demand, a very obvious demand for more feedback, and tutors' reluctance to commit to providing more in what is actually a time-consuming convention that exists already. So let's think about feedback in context. Feedback on student learning has a place, but it's only one element in a process that we call feedback for student learning. So feedback's expected by students, and we need to clarify what it is that's appropriate to their discipline or mode of study. So on a course like the PGCE, we've stressed a great deal that there is little contact time and therefore few opportunities for feedback from the tutor, but instead activities encourage dialogue with peers or with colleagues, and they're intended to serve the same supportive function. In an undergraduate face-to-face program, one might commit to say that there are many more opportunities for feedback and use the word frequently to describe the kind of interaction that you're having with students. So here are 4 simple rules to consider when you're thinking about feedback in your context. First of all, one ensures that students know where feedback is going to come from. So where might feedback come from? Maybe not just you, but also other students, from themselves and so on. So be clear about where feedback might be sought. Think about the timelines for feedback, but again, my note of caution would be that feedback should actually be a continuous process. It shouldn't just be about you will have your work marked within a week. Ensure that students know what you mean by feedback, so explore this notion of feedback with students in your early interactions. And finally, know what students should do with feedback. The idea that in fact there is nothing final about feedback. Feedback is always part of a process, part of an ongoing dialogue that you have with the student. And this harks back to Diana Laurelard's conversational framework that we looked at in Module 1. The second thing is to focus on the idea that whilst you are, as the tutor, facilitating feedback, you are not the sole source of feedback. One of the barriers to the notion of more feedback is ingrained in our notion that tutors are where that happens, that we're the ones that play that role of providing feedback. And feedback opportunities exist, there are many of them, as we'll see. But actually the important thing is that we highlight the different range and multiplicity of feedback. Now there's an interesting cultural dimension because not all students will respect voices in the same way. Not all voices are respected equally. Sometimes students won't take feedback from other tutees, for example. They'll only take it from the tutor. And it's important that we actually integrate students into our mode of learning that says that perhaps other voices, whether it's their peers, whether it's people out in the professions, whether it's themselves, that these are also recognized as authoritative voices. So we need to explain what we mean by feedback. So 4 modes of feedback that you might want to reflect on and consider as to whether they're appropriate in your practice are the notion that one might co-opt others. This could be people from industry, it could be people from the sector, it could be other students on the same program, but it could also be possibly students from higher levels of the program. So you might have students in say a level 4 module on an undergraduate program having their work marked or fed back on, graded and fed back on by someone working at level 6. And it could well be that in some contexts the students from those higher levels are providing feedback as an assessed activity in its own right. But this idea that one can look to co-opt others is important. The second thing is to think about self-assessment. Students can be given marking rubrics, they can be given criteria, they can be encouraged to self-assess. I've handed out the criteria for contributions in the past in order to get people to contribute to seminars. I've actually handed out criteria and asked students to take them away and mark themselves and others in the session. So I'm asking students whether they spoke freely, whether they felt constrained, whether they felt able to base their contributions on the reading, was it just their subjective opinion, what did they think of peers' contributions, whose contributions did they value most, why did they value those contributions, and as a consequence students actually become much more aware both of the value of the activity but also its purpose and their responsibility within it. It's quite interesting that quite often students will say, well, I valued so-and-so's contributions because they'd obviously done the reading, and that in itself raises the awareness of the underlying learning and teaching strategy of the module. So getting students to actually feed back on themselves is quite important. In some contexts it's possible and valuable to get students to share their learning journey, to know that others share misconceptions, that others have different means to progress, they have different tools at their disposal. So an in-class activity could be developed to encourage students to maybe comment on work. This can be done in pairs or it can be done in triads. Often I think triads work very, very well. So it might be possible to have students write a short 1-minute paper, perhaps a definition or a piece of succinct commentary, which is a useful skill in itself in an awful lot of disciplines. But they can also do this in a fairly anonymous way. So they might write an imaginary name on it, and those pieces of paper get shuffled around the class and redistributed. And every student reads out that 1-minute response, but they're not reading out their own. And this can actually then be quite a good way of getting students to openly critique the feedback that's been given, because they don't associate what's just been said with the individual that's saying it. And often that relieves students from any fear that they might offend. And one useful way of time saving is to give feedback in the context of whole cohort feedback. It has the advantage of being able to give feedback where in fact there was no single prompt. So you may actually have a number of things you want to feed back to the group, and you can do that therefore collectively after every session. So one thing that's worked very well in the past for me is a short 5-minute paper can be set in the last 5 minutes of a class, for example. I realize it doesn't work in every discipline, but just by way of example, that in this little 5-minute paper that students are writing, they're collected, they're given a mark, and they're fed back to the individual student. But the actual feedback is given as a whole class feedback session at the beginning of the following session. And that allows you to actually provide fairly generic comment as well as individual specific comment, but to everybody, not just to the one individual. Very much time saving, but also giving people a sense that they're embarking on this endeavour together. So we've looked at the different groundings for feedback, the understanding that needs to be shared with learners, and we've looked here at a number of 4 different ways in which one might conceptualize the type of feedback that's given, and a number of ideas have been suggested. What I want to do is also think about how feedback could be delivered throughout a learning session. And by way of example, I want to just walk through what could happen in a face-to-face context if one chose to seek every opportunity to give feedback. So in this example, what we're looking at is the idea that opportunities for feedback are often not taken by faculty, by tutors. And the suggestion here is that students will respond to feedback in lots of different ways if it's identified as such, as a continuous process. So describing to students feedback as an element in their learning raises their awareness of it and of its value. an opportunity to support a student in grounding their learning so that the student actually says, yeah, I get that, or to set them up to prepare to move forward. Each of those is a feedback moment. So, by way of example, starting at the bottom and working our way up here, a student might arrive in class and they might see a question, they might see something displayed on the board. It might be the learning objectives for a previous session, and it might say, do you believe that you're coming to this session having achieved those? Are you prepared for this session? It might be that it's a question that they may well already seek to answer, so they go in with expectation to the coming session. The point is that the first few moments of a class, the students settle, should not be lost, and displaying something, I think, is quite a useful thing to do. As the students settle, they might find some cohort feedback on the table waiting for them. For example, a piece of paper maybe asks them a question. It may be that as everyone settles, they actually fill out that question. It might be that they actually do a little quiz on the table. So as people arrive on the table, there's a quiz, and in some cases this encourages people simply to turn up early in order to be part of that process. So, I mean, it sounds, in some cases, in professional education, that can sound a little trite, but in many cases where we're concerned about attendance, we're concerned about punctuality, this can actually be quite a useful technique. It manages, so another technique for managing that prompt attendance, and also a great self-feedback opportunity, is to set a short activity at the beginning of a class. So it may be that based on preparatory work, which encourages students to do it, you might have students answer a relatively simple orientation task, so that they may have come from another class, they're orientating themselves to the subject under discussion, and it could be that these short assignments form part of some overall assessment. So it might be in depending on the nature of the program and the way the course is designed, that if they submit 70% of these, they're demonstrating obviously attendance in that way. So this can be a very powerful way of getting students to identify what they didn't understand, and this can be picked up later in cohort feedback. It might be possible to arrange the learning and teaching activities in such a way as to promote these feedback opportunities, and the important thing is that we need to label them. So pausing, for example, to do a minute paper which other students look at, grade. Getting students to do in-class voting. Now, whether that's using some kind of clicker technology, it may be using coloured card. I've seen some fantastic examples where the handbooks that students bring into class have a green cover and a red cover, front and back. That's an absolute gift for actually getting people to hold up their handbooks to vote for a particular issue, or to just show the colours to indicate whether they want a topic to be revised, whether they want a topic to be gone into in more detail, whether they're happy to move on, and so on. Or it might be just using a show of hands, and one of the subtle variations on this is something we call fist and five. So you might ask for degrees of agreement. It may be that if they show a fist, they're okay with it. They show all 5 fingers spread, that actually they definitely are in favour, and in a sense they can indicate degrees of agreement by showing different numbers of fingers. Again, sounds rather trite in some contexts, but in other contexts it works extremely well. One could turn the voting process into something of a game. So it may be that individual understanding becomes something more collective when you actually say, well, what is it that you believe as an individual? What is it that you believe as a group? How many people actually agree with this? You can then ask people to be putting their hands down progressively as the questions become more complicated, and so on. So voting games within the classroom become a form of feedback on how my learning and my understanding relates to other people's around me. I think it's also useful to get students to declare the next steps. Ask them what it is that they want to achieve from future feedback. This could be asking them to complete a piece of paper in front of them that asks about session objectives, where they want more learning to take place. It might be about getting students to use their mobile phones or laptops to post questions during the class, which may be answered in class or may be collated and answered afterwards. One useful technique which I've used in the past has been getting students to use the little stickies. We put the the post-its on the table, and actually say to them, if you've got questions outstanding at the end of the session that you want covered next session, if there are still things that you found difficult, just write them down in a fairly legible form, just stick them on the back of the door as you leave. And you literally see students sticking these things on the back of the door. Now, often students will just scribble things like, I didn't understand the March of 1965 stuff, or students will write, more examples please, which in itself doesn't seem that helpful, but over time when you build up a dialogue with the class, it gives you a sense of what's possible for them, what they understand, what they don't understand. And then obviously there are post-session opportunities to test students' learning and progression. So there's the classic sort of MCQs after a session, there's classic discussion forum, possibly a short paper. And if you provide a template for that short paper in a very structured way, that can actually then provide something as a basis for the next session. So all of these techniques can and do work in some but not all contexts, and the important thing here is that you need to determine what your students would benefit from. But feedback is possible throughout a learning and teaching encounter. What we might think of as a learning and teaching activity is in fact an opportunity for the learner to identify whether or not their learning is on track, whether in fact they're learning in the way that they're anticipating, that you anticipate, that they are making the progress that's expected. Now, at BPP, we've actually produced some guidelines for feedback, and these were approved by the Education Training Committee in September of 2012. The guidelines are a distillation of some best practice in the sector. They're branded under the notion of 7 tactics, and tactics standing for timely, amount, clear, tone, informs teaching, constructive and specific. And I think it's fairly self-evident, but I'm going to run through them very quickly. So the notion that feedback should be returned as soon as possible after assessment and should be forward-looking. Well, we've talked about forward-looking in this presentation. The notion that it should be timely, obviously if it's happening in session, it's extremely timely. So whilst this as guidance refers to how quickly feedback might be given on some written work, it also highlights the importance of that in-class feedback. The idea that feedback should focus on a limited number of points of evidence, balancing strengths as well as weakness, self-evident when one's writing feedback, one stresses the things that are good as well as the things that are negative. But again, in all of the feedback for learning that I've been describing in this presentation, one would limit this to a number of focal points that are related to the teaching underway, and I think actually in an in-class situation that's often an easier thing to achieve. This is where it becomes very obvious and clear that feedback should be about the task, processing the task and self-regulation. Is when you do these things in class, it's very clear how this relates to the learning that's actually underway, and students are very clear about the future steps. We've talked about tone, so the idea that feedback should be supportive, it should be stimulating, it should be motivating, and some of the in-class examples that I've given you can actually be quite fun. You know, the hilarity in the classroom is no bad thing. And effective feedback promotes autonomy. It promotes this idea that the student is taking ownership of the learning and some responsibility for the learning. If there's something they don't understand, they should tell you that they don't understand it. I found the question and answers wall that students post to as they leave a class an extremely useful way of telling them that they can't get to the end of the course and say that at no point did we address something if they never asked for it to be addressed. So they take some responsibility. It informs teaching. Good feedback, as evidenced I think in the examples that have already been given in this presentation, will suggest enhancements. They'll suggest ways in which as a tutor one can actually change the pattern of teaching or change some of the content of teaching from week to week to pick up on themes that are emerging through feedback. The C is for constructive. It should identify how learning outcomes and assessment are being met. And I think each week the idea that one maps objectives to outcomes is a useful model. We've done that on this course, and I know a number of you are doing it on your programs as well. You have objectives for each session. Sometimes you call them outcomes, but you have objectives. And the idea that actually all the feedback given is very clearly targeted to where you are in a program, how it relates to the outcomes, how it relates to assessment, and so on. And specific, because Although there are some opportunities to do some general feedback at the cohort level, where feedback is given to an individual student, it does need to very specifically address both the learning outcomes and the assessment criteria. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope the lecture itself will have given you some thoughts, given you some ideas